You're tuned into the Unnecessary Harm podcast, where we drill down on issues of substance use and its cultural impact. Your host, Shane Varco, Executive Director of the Delgado Institute, with over 40 years experience in youth and community work and a passion for building resilience.
Welcome to the Unnecessary Harm podcast. It's good to have you with us again. What's being a frontline worker look and feel like, particularly the thin blue line, in dealing with substance use, legal and illegal, in our communities? Attending drug poisonings, alcohol-fueled violence and road trauma, confronting drug dealers, pursuing drug-related criminal activity, dealing with the horrendous trauma to families. What does it do for those protective actors in our communities? How are they and their families impacted by this distressing and completely unnecessary harm? There is one group that works in this vital arena. Fortem Australia is a health and wellbeing NGO that places high importance on connecting the first responder community to accessible, quality and relevant information that can promote insight, reflection and help seeking to support those vital people as they navigate these incredibly stormy cultural waters. A long-time ambassador for Fortem Australia is Simone Lord. And not only is she a previous guest on the Unnecessary Harm podcast, but a health and wellbeing lifestyle coach and consultant, as well as an operations manager within Australia's National Disability Scheme. Simone is also one of the starting partners for our World Resiliency Day International platform, and we're grateful for her involvement in that space. But perhaps most importantly, for the purposes of today's episode, she is the wife of a serving police officer and knows more intimately than most what our first responders go through. Simone Lord, welcome back to the Unnecessary Harm podcast.
Shane, it is always a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you very much for having me on this episode.
Fantastic. No, it's great to see you again. And our listeners will enjoy the follow-up and the bookend to your previous interview. I think it's great. Simone, in our previous conversation, look, you shared quite vulnerably about your brother and subsequent family issues around his alcohol and obviously migrating into illicit drug use and what that meant for your family and the incredibly, impacting reality of that. And that was really valuable to our listeners. And so, we do appreciate that candor. And today, look, we want to go in a little bit different direction with that. But today we want to connect with you about the AOD issue and our frontline workers, particularly the police, and your very personal connection in that space. I think that's the key issue here. I think the insights that you'll bring as a family member, as a spouse, are really, really important. So before we drill down into your personal story, tell us a little bit more about Fortem and your ambassador role.
Yeah, sure. So I first came to find out about Fortem when I was running my health and fitness business. I specifically wanted to target shift working families in that because of my lived experience in this area. And I think I was quite shocked to find out that as a frontline worker family, I didn't already know about this service that existed. It was something that hadn't been communicated to us. So Fortem Australia is as you mentioned, health and wellbeing, physical and mental health and wellbeing for frontline workers and their families. So this is support that we can access from our side of being on the other side of a community service worker as well. So that's when I first found out about it, and I had to be a part of it. I had to know more. I had to advocate for this, and I wanted to be able to utilize this service if I needed it, if my husband needed it, if my kids needed it. So it was really important for me to want to use my platform, my voice, my lived experience to share the journey.
Brilliant. Yeah, and I think that's certainly borne out in what you've done community-wise, and certainly in our previous interview, we sort of spelunk some of that, which is really, really, really great. Love your work, love your passion, and it's holistic. I love the fact that you do with family on both protective as well as developmental sides of things, which is really great. But your hubby is currently a serving police officer, is that correct?
Yes, so he's been a part of the New South Wales Police Force for 14 years now.
Wow. Okay.
So his career has been extensive here in New South Wales, and particularly prominent in motor vehicles and things that happen in that side of things.
Right.
So within the crash investigation unit and also highway patrol. So he sees a lot of substance and alcohol abuse in those kind of scenarios.
that's leads me into my next question. And I think that's really important because what happens, as we opened up with, I mean, being a seasoned police officer, he's seen a great deal, and it doesn't mean that it just because you bump into this consistently, you can become a little bit calloused. You have to be for your own protection, but to maintain that humanity in that space is really important. But the vicarious, this is the thing a lot of people I don't think really understand. It's like, oh, I can shut it out or I can switch off, but the vicarious trauma that a lot of our first responders, particularly police officers and AMBOs, can experience in engaging with people that are, as a result of our engagement with the alcohol and other drugs. And obviously, clearly in this, your hubby space is the road trauma. What was that like for him? Does he relate that to you, or does he have to grapple with that? Is that something you can share without, breaching confidences?
Yeah, I think it goes both ways in terms of if you have a good relationship with your partner, you can talk about these things and debrief the situation that happens. I think the most challenging situations come when we sit down for dinner, and we like to have dinner as a family. We all sit down together, and when you ask, Dad, how was your day today? And I get this look from him like, I can't tell the kids anything that happened to my day today because it's all so traumatic and overwhelming. And I was like, well, just tell them what you had for lunch or pick something small. Like I need to support him through what he can say and what he can do to try and find a moment. And I think people often forget that our community service workers, their every day is your worst day.
Yeah.
So when you're engaging with any of these people, whether it's police, fire, ambulance, nurses, doctors, your most traumatic moments is what they deal with every single day. And we often forget how much that pressure can become overwhelming.
Yeah, and that's an important statement to make. And I'm glad you brought that up. I think that makes a clear juxtapose for a lot of people because, again, as you've just beautifully said, I won't repeat it. The difficulty for most people is that, we don't see it consistently. And there's part of the journey of developing strength and resiliency and growth and dealing well and dealing thoroughly and dealing healthfully with the trauma, vicarious trauma, and the real confrontation sometimes or violent encounters with, your husband may not have experienced that, but certainly a lot of police officers have to deal with violence and against them. And they're just for the dispatching of their duties, and so that kind of stuff is quite distressing. Having worked in juvenile justice, having riots go on and just people want to kill you and bash you up, and it is one of the most distressing things, and it doesn't easily go away, and you need to process that well. So, and obviously the kids are one issue, and sometimes it may be pertinent with the lived experience and earned resiliency of dad, to be able to say to the kids, you know what, I see the results of alcohol and other drug use every day, guys. You just don't want to go down this rabbit hole. Trust me on this one. And as they get older, you may be able to share something. But as a spouse, as a wife, are you able to do that? Obviously, private debrief with him and work through that, as well as with groups like Fortem, or is he in that space where he can actually now develop it with himself, or is he still obviously need to see not so much professional help, but what I'm saying, debrief through professional circles for his own benefit?
I think different circumstances trigger different things. Whenever it comes to anything where, obviously, as you mentioned before, you build up these resiliencies and these coping mechanisms and some unfavorable humor, some might say, those kinds of things to cope through the situation.
I've done it. Yeah, trust me. Yeah.
So I think whenever it comes to a situation where it becomes very relatable to your family, so there was an instance where, a young teen was injured on her way after just finishing working at McDonald's, and one of our nieces work at McDonald's. So it hits harder when you feel that it can relate to you and you can't change it from just being a situation and black and white. And when it becomes an emotional attachment, that's when it becomes a little bit more difficult to process in our experiences of that. And it is a really fine line between educating and wanting to share the experience and also not passing on what we call spillover stress. From Fortem Australia, this is something they explain to us as families of when we're sharing things, we need to be careful how we're doing that we're not then passing on the anxiety and the fear of those things to our children or to our partners. And then that becomes difficult because then you feel like maybe I shouldn't share because I don't want to be a burden. I don't want them to feel the overwhelm. And then that's another issue in itself, that you're not getting through those emotional releases that you need.
Yeah, and I think that's another facet of this. I'm glad you've tipped into that space, because I think one of the difficulties with sharing, and particularly on the person as well, everyone's got their own coping mechanisms, their own filters, and for themselves and for others. And so if a person, for example, and I have no idea how your hubby communicates, but for a person who's a closed communicator and who doesn't share openly, is not verbose or, communicative, then when that gets locked in and they don't know how to process that, or feel they can't process that can create some real back pressure if there's not an effective release for them to actually, and again, a healthy release, because there are unhealthy releases. And I still remember being working as a forest officer in another life at that road, but I used to be firefighting was part of my job, and so I understand what it's like to be in that space. But I still remember finding a suicide in the forest in a car, and one of the policemen that came, there was three of them that came, and it was clearly that was a suicide. There was a note and everything, so it was pretty straightforward. But one of the policemen was I could tell he was distressed, and he was shaking, a little bit shaking, and he wasn't a young guy. He'd been around a bit, but obviously he was on burnout. I'd suggest he was on burnout, but he started making some really, really, really inappropriate jokes. And his other police officers were looking at him and and our forest officer, our manager, had to pull him up and say, "Dude, just back it off. Whoa." And he went, "Oh, what?" I said, "Oh, sorry, no, dude, I get it. It's an awful situation, but enough with the comments." So I still remember that. And so this guy was obviously inappropriately processing, and I think this is a long time before Fortem existed, I think. So I think it's great that these places are there.
Fortem have only been around for 5 years, so they haven't been around for very long.
I went years ago. So it was another world and another time, and I'm sure I'm aged here. But it is, I get it. And that was the old days where you look, "Oh, mate, suck it up, have a beer, you'll be right, get over it,
Yeah.
And that kind of mentality just creates a suppression mode, and that suppression mode of particularly vicarious trauma, it just builds and builds and builds, and you have these blowouts. But as a wife, and I mean, again, as much as you can share, Simone, as a wife, in your place of connecting with hubby, that he feels safe and comfortable to share that, so he feels connected to you, but not impacting or infecting you. Is that something you've been able to develop as a couple?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's definitely boundaries that you find within yourself, whether you can sense through someone's body language whether they're actually starting to feel a little bit uncomfortable, or is this perhaps, impending on them too much? And when does the conversation need to change from debriefing this with my partner to perhaps I need to speak to someone else or access the EAP program and different things like that. Go and speak to one of the Fortem counsellors and those sorts of things. I think we still have a long way to go in terms of acceptable language around when you're not struggling with your mental health and things like that. There's a lot of stigma about head noise, and there's something that they call a mortgage buster.
Okay.
So if you are someone who is experiencing mental health and you go off into a workers' comp, or you decide that you can no longer cope with duty and you may have PTSD, there's this stigma around you can't see mental health, right? So people look okay from the outside, but you don't know what's happening underneath the surface. And people will often make snide kind of comments and remarks about that, of just going, "Oh, you're just getting a payout, you just want to get out," instead of really uncovering, seeking help. They're worried that they will then be spoken about unfavorably, or, there's these undertones that come with seeking help, which is really unfortunate. We need to break that.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting one. I'd not heard that before, but that makes sense. I would have used different language for that. It's like it's you're taking the easy way out. You're doing a runner, and you're getting a payout. You come in for a while, leave. Same in the military too. I've dealt with some wonderful support groups in the military that are dealing with obviously the trauma that a lot of returned vets receive, and they don't want to be the soldier. I don't want to be paid out, so I might as well kill myself. Literally, it's the other option for a lot of these guys, which is
it's
just
absolutely
shocking.
an identity.
Shocking. Yeah,
and sometimes as much for the serving officer as it is for the wife or the partner of. It's part of my identity. When I'm introduced, I will say I'm a police wife. It's part of who I am. It's almost like a tribe or a community that I'm a part of, or that I'm seeking as well. So a lot of the times when people are looking to leave the community services industry, there is a huge loss of identity of who am I without this. And I know that a lot of athletes have the same sort of thing that happens when they're not in the elite sporting arena anymore. It's this loss of, this is so much of my personality and who I am, and who am I without this.
Yeah, I think one of the issues we bumped into over the years is attaching, particularly with men, attach identity to role, and again, that sense of what makes me not so much human. I think that's something we can identify, but more it makes me a man. And then in an era, in a multiple generations now that don't have rites of passage, for women, a rite of passage is often very clear, and it's part of their journey. I mean, having kids, reaching that time of their menstruation, all those kind of things, and their kind of season. But for guys, it's what is it? It's what you do. It's okay. I do this thing, and I'm a man, or I'm important, or I'm whatever they may be. And those kind of narratives, although they've certainly been disappearing over the last 20 years, and my experience working with men over the last 35 years, that's disappearing, but it's still there. And I think in roles like military, police, ambo, and especially high stressful, important, incredibly important protective roles, that kind of identity seeps into your very marrow. It's like, well, I'm a protector, and now I'm not. What am I? And that has a huge impact on marriages and families, which we won't go into today, because that's a whole other podcast. We won't drill down on that one with you. It's a surprise.
It's a new topic, will we?
That's a hand grenade, an IED. We won't throw in today. But yeah, I think that's incredibly important. And groups like Fortem, and obviously what you do, and community wellbeing, and developing healthy community understandings about what it is to be a person, a community member that's outside of a role and a function. And I think that's important. Our humanity is geared to much greater things than that. But look, I talked a little bit about the impact on the home and how you manage that. Obviously, you've shared a little bit about how you manage it with the kids. Have you, I'm just aware of the questions I'm asking you, very personal, and I understand, the limitations here, not expecting anything that you don't want to share. But with your kids, obviously being dad's a copper, I've got a nephew who's a copper, and it's like, how does that play out, with the kids, the dad being a police officer? Your kids are what, teenagers or not quite?
No, they're still quite young. So we have 3 boys. They're 10, 8, and 6 years old. So they've known no different from their dad being a police officer. It's the only career that they've known him to have in that kind of regard. Again, I think it comes down to communication and awareness. The biggest thing that they struggle with is the shift work.
Right.
And the uncertainty of a pattern and of a roster, of a routine. And I think that's why I became so routined and really pushed to have different modes of communication dependent on their age, so they could understand more what's going on. I truly believe that kids thrive with routine and stability.
They do.
And in a situation where a parent is not able to provide that through their career options, there has to be some sort of stability or some sort of constant to give them that grounding that they need. So that is something that I've pushed hard for since the kids were small. And it came down to little things like having a piece of paper up on the fridge, or like a magnet that's on the fridge to draw a sun when dad's on day shift, draw a moon when he's on night shift, so they can understand dad's not home tonight, and those sorts of things. And I still recall a very you laugh it off, but you think, wow, that was pretty traumatic to hear about that. When my husband was working in crash investigation, they get deployed anywhere within New South Wales. So essentially, he can call me and say, I'm not coming home now. I may not be home for a few days.
Oh, wow.
Whatever the situation was. Yep. So my son was only in preschool at the time, and I dropped him off to daycare, and he said there was a crash last night and my dad's not coming home.
Oh.
And I remember these preschool teachers looking at me like, oh my gosh, what's happened? I'm like, oh, no. My husband's okay. Everything's fine. He's actually a police officer.
Yeah.
He's on overtime, but you laugh it off, but you don't process the impact that had on those workers to hear that. And if I wasn't there to catch that conversation of what my 3-year-old said at the time, and also how is his little mind processing that? Does he actually understand his dad's okay? Does he think that something else is going on? So it is a huge impact on the family of community service workers, as much as it is the person actually doing the service.
Oh, okay, that's it. And that's one of the things I wanted to sort of draw out today, I think, for our listeners. I think people understand there's obviously a ripple effect, flow-on effect. I don't think anyone's shocked to hear that. But I think the depth of that, and just that little anecdote you shared, is indicative of how this can creep into your daily narrative. And when a 3-year-old, communicating honestly, that what he understands, dad's he's not investigating. Dad's away with work at a car crash, But when the 3-year-old brain puts it out, it's like, but he's actually learning to process that, and I think that's helpful. But again, without those bump bowling guides to help him develop an understanding of what's going on, and so he doesn't get traumatized by things, because he could hear something as they get older. They hear something, policeman, involved in car accident at New South Wales, and all. Was Dad working up there, and that kind of thing. Those kind of moments can be quite traumatic. Have you had any of those experiences, or?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's something that we manage ongoing, that we could be driving somewhere and hear sirens, and the kids will all be heightened and alert in the car. Dad, what's happening? What's going on? Do you have to go and help? And it's like, no, Dad's not on duty. He's not on shift. All of those kinds of things that you need to manage, that they're constantly elevated. They're already experiencing anxiety, overwhelm, cortisol spikes from the spillover effect of what does that mean and how does that impact me and my family.
Yeah, and I think that's a message I'm going to throw this in for our listeners' benefit, and for our basic tenets behind the Unnecessary Harm podcast, is that these vicarious events that happen to families, listeners, are really something you've got to take into account. It's not just, coppers, they can handle this. This is a ripple effect. And when you misuse alcohol and you use illicit substances and you act out like clowns and you drive cars, or you do crime, or you do become violent, the impact goes way beyond your own and family and your own environment and those people that you're perpetrating a crime against. This affects emergency services, police, ambulance, nurses, and a ripple effect to their kids. It goes on and on and on. And we've just heard how this can impact young kids in the car, but who are, I can imagine Ambo's kids would be similar as well. They hear sirens, they go, oh, geez, what's happening there? So really important, listeners, to get a handle on this and start understanding this a little bit more and be a little bit more aware of what this does for our first responders. I think that's a really important message to get across. So I'm just going to take license there and dish that out. And
I feel like alcohol is one of those things that in Australia, it is a social norm. I don't even want to say that, because I think we are getting marginally better at saying no, but there's such a social obsession with having to have a drink, or we debrief a bad day with a drink. We celebrate a good day with a drink. I grew up in a household where alcohol was very prevalent, and you can't help but wonder if that was the catalyst that started the evolution for my brother. And you can't say those things. You don't know it, but it does help wonder, is that the doorway that so many people are experiencing into a journey of drugs and alcohol?
Well, we'll drill down a little bit on that a bit later on. I think that's an important insight. And we know from the evidence, just again for yourself and for listeners too, we know from the evidence now, we talk the term gateway, and of course the pro-drug advocates hate that word. And they say, oh, cannabis is not a gateway drug. Well, we're not talking about cannabis. Nicotine and alcohol for the developing brain, so and particularly under the age of 18, is a definite trigger. It is the gateway. You want to start addiction or the risk of addiction, start using nicotine and or alcohol under the age of 18. That is the evidence, and that is just rock solid. And so it is a catalyst for those things. So does it happen to every single person who has nicotine and alcohol? We're not saying that. Does every person who drinks as a 17-year-old become an alcoholic? We're not saying that either. But the evidence is very, very clear from, again, clinical studies, peer-reviewed and published studies, that nicotine and alcohol for the developing brain are a nightmare. They're like time bombs going off. So that's something that Australians need to get a handle on. And because the old Aussie, like you said, perfectly, we celebrate, we commiserate. In fact, we just sit in the backyard on a chair and drink because we're bored. That's kind of the staple of our social settings. But that's shifting, and I think that's important. But one of the things I wanted to and you may not be able to answer this because of where hubby works specifically, but I was interested, as a woman by the name of Dr. Marion Hatcher, some of our listeners may be aware of her. She's an African-American US operator who got really messed up, but as an anti-sex and anti-drug trafficker, she worked for the Cook County Sheriff's Office, which is the Department of Policy, and she was an advocate, for against particularly sex trafficking and substances, because they are almost inseparable in the public square, these two operations. And she started her recovery and restoration journey out of the shattering world of drug and sex trafficking when she was arrested. It changed her life. I want you to hear this. I want listeners to hear this. She got to the point that she said, this is her own words, and in fact she gave testimonial to Congress in the US. She said, crack cocaine brought me to my knees. That drug became the love of my life and told me it was okay to leave my children. All right, this is what addiction does. When the law was finally permitted to deal with her, her response was profound but not uncommon. She said, those arresting officers were angels with handcuffs. I think that, and there's a number of, we know a number of people personally, but also from the various places that we operate in, that when they're finally arrested, and we call it the judicial educator, it's not a punitive response. So, you're a bad person, we're going to stick you in jail. Actually, we're going to arrest your behavior because you cannot control it any longer. And the ripple effect and the damage you're doing is untold to yourself and all those around you. Like cocaine caused her to leave her children. Alcohol does this all the time. It's the legal and most common drug. Oh, I just want another drink. I just want another drink. I'll do anything for another drink. I'll leave my kids. I'll abandon my kids. We all know that's true. But again, when that judicial educator is put in place and that behaviour is arrested, then we can move into a restorative, rehabilitative process. And yes, that can include incarceration because it's about, we call it secure welfare. It's not being slotted for being a bad person. You need to be in a safe, secure place so you can start getting out of this arena. And this woman became a great advocate for this. Has hubby ever been involved, or do you know any other police officers who've been involved in a moment where they've arrested an alcoholic or a drug user, and that from that moment on there was a shift, that there was like it really caught up with them. They started saying, I've got to change now. Is that something that you guys have experienced?
Yeah, I can't think of a specific situation, but as a generalization as well, you are waiting for people to hit their rock bottom to stop this cycle of behavior. It is a cycle. It's something that you see continually happen. And especially for people or officers that are in the general duties role, they are the ones that are seeing this repeated behavior and these frustrations of people who are not ready to change or haven't hit their rock bottom yet, to have that awakening moment to really snap out of it and want to be doing something different. And that's when you can get really disheartened in these community services roles, because you're not there for the money. Let's be honest. It is not that different to any other position that you hold.
That's it.
Exactly. They're there because they really want to make a difference and they feel like they can. But then they feel stuck in a system that is broken, that is not supporting in so many ways. And the daily grind, like I said, this is there every day. It wears you down. and you feel helpless that you cannot help people break the cycle of sometimes generational situations.
Yeah.
Other times you just watch very prominent people just destroy their whole lives over addiction. And it's heartbreaking to watch that. It's heartbreaking to advocate to the family and have that situation with them as well.
Yes.
It's a really challenging situation.
Yeah. No. And I think that's that reality is becoming more and more stark, particularly if we want to juxtapose it with the US when they decided they were going to liberalise more drugs. Okay, we can't arrest our way, was the standard line. They can't arrest our way out of this problem. I still remember having a personal meeting with a previous head of police in New South Wales, Scipione. I had a meeting in his office, one-on-one, about 10 years ago. And he made that statement too. He was certainly not advocating that we stop, using the law to process this. So we can't arrest our way out of this. We need to have other factors in play. But what I said to him and I've said to others is we cannot treat our way out of this problem either. They're both black holes of problems. We need to have a holistic approach. And one of the things about drug courts, for example, and that intervention, that what we call the judicial educator intervention, is okay, you have been arrested and you got two options here. We can put you in jail, or you can go into a diversion program. And not just to tick the box here, don't go to jail, but to actually learn from this and be in secure welfares. Now, we know a prison in the WA has done this brilliantly. And they don't talk, no one talks about it. It's been promoted a little bit in the media, but their success rate is huge. People are actually put in secure welfare. It is part of the prison, and they are incarcerated. They can't leave. But then the whole program is about recalibrating. It's not a punitive process. It's a recalibration process. And it does work, but it starts with the officer being able to say, okay, it ends today. I'm going to arrest you, and I'm going to take you to a place that's going to help you get better. I'm not just going to arrest you, put you in the turnstile, bail out you go again, round and round, and we come back next week for the domestic violence, or come back next week for the car crash that's killed your wife and your daughter, or your husband and your daughter, depending on whose it is, because unfortunately a lot of women are now in this space, tragically. The 1 o'clock phenomena has been huge, and 3 o'clock in the afternoon, school pickups. We've got more than enough stories about that behaviour, and around children, picking up kids with at 2.4 on the breathalyzer in school zones. I mean, let's not get in that route today, but it's quite horrendous to see that. But I think it's really important for us to understand that there is a better way forward. And in the US, they're now starting to reverse that. They liberalise all these drugs. Oh, it's going to be, no, it's not going to work. This is not working. So they're now winding it back. British Columbia winding it back. Oregon's now reversed their initial decriminalising of drugs because they know this does not work. And there's still some actors in this country trying for this, but hopefully sanity will prevail, and we will use the law to educate and to transform and to recalibrate, not to punish, almost to punish people. I think there's a great line from Hope in Hawaii, HOPE. I can't remember the acrostics wording, but it's a judicial educator. They said we want to put people in jail that we're scared of, not people that we're mad at. And I think that's a really good line. And so we are mad at these people. They are out of control, but we don't want to slot them in a jail. We don't want to give them a criminal record. We do want them to be better. And the only way we can do that sometimes is through secure welfare. But that's it for another day. You did express concern. Obviously, you've done it before, and you in our previous interview, you indicated your concerns about the intergenerational stuff, and obviously your brother's story and your own experience with alcohol. And you're obviously a family that probably, would it be fair to say you have that drink occasionally? Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, absolutely
so
true.
You're not abstinent, that's fine, but you understand where alcohol fits. You understand that certainly intoxication is not a smart move, and your kids are watching that from all sorts of levels, which is really good. So responsible use of alcohol, really, really important in a generation that's obviously obsessed with it. But you talked a little bit previously about the intergenerational stuff, but what are you seeing in your community, the harms from alcohol? What are you seeing personally in your experience around with your kids, your own peers, obviously your husband, but what are you seeing in your environments where you're consulting, where you're even in NDIS? What are some of the things that you're bumping into, and what concerns you most about those?
I think it's the early age that it starts within, because it is somewhat illegal, meaning legal, not illegal.
Right.
It is legal. I definitely was subject to underage drinking because it was a mindset of I'd rather my child drink under my roof than going out on the street or
Wow.
trying it somewhere else, you know.
Yep.
So it was almost a justification as a parent that I will let my child do this underage because I'm making an excuse that this is okay. I think that's where the beginning is of it could be a whole change of early intervention if we didn't allow those things to happen. Not letting them have one sip or what's the harm in just giving them a taste. Those kinds of things. We don't need to create this excitement or this exposure to it if we don't need to. Now, my kids certainly know what alcohol is. They have seen us have a drink, but we try not to really do that in front of them or expose them to those kinds of things to ask the questions. But they do ask the questions. What is that? What are you having? Is that a wine? Is that a beer? You know, answering, I think having open communication, don't leave it to be this curious, mysterious thing that they are then seeking for, that they're seeing. I think in our situation, it is a little bit different because they've seen the exposure to some of my brother's behaviors of that. And we have open conversations about that when it's like, oh, how come this is happening to our uncle and those sorts of things. And it will become, especially now my eldest son is on his way to being 11, it's a little bit more of an open conversation of this is a consequence for your action. He can't drive because he drank alcohol and drove his car. He got caught. He can no longer drive.
Yeah.
And it's interesting for their perception of a lack of sympathy, I guess, for the situation, rather than thinking, oh, that's sad or that's a shame, rather than really understanding that this is a consequence for poor behaviour and poor action.
No, very good. I think it's important. And one of the things about laws, and just for our listeners as well, secondary supply laws, which is a law talks about giving alcohol to minors. Now, in a family situation, you can give your children alcohol. In some states, it's, you know, there's a level at age. In some states, it's down to 2. You can, at 2 years of age. No, it's madness. But secondary supply laws, giving alcohol to other children is not permitted under the age of 18 without written consent from their parents. Now, Victoria is one of the last states in Australia to do it. New South Wales had it in play for decades, which was great. So if, you know, your son went to Billy's house and Billy or Billy's mum, forget the age, doesn't matter, there's a open liquor cabinet and your son gets into that liquor cabinet, that family's liable. And they are heavily fined for that because even though their son might have given it to him, no. And that's law. Now, Victoria took forever to put that in play. That's how ridiculous it is. But now they're catching up with these laws. And so there's huge fines now. And, of course, we're having these binge 16-year-old parties where keggers were being put out and everyone's getting blind. And all of a sudden they introduced the fines of $8,000 per child. Guess what happened? The keggers disappeared. Street riots disappeared. Street parties vanished because of the police attend. And there's, you got 50 kids, even you catch 6 of them and there's no written permission from their parents and they're drunk. That's $48,000 right there. You got to pay. So parents went, no more parties, no more 16 binge parties. So again, legally, it's responsible to do so. But I think that the consequence is really important. This is a grown-up, and this is the thing that I think is really fascinating, being a person that doesn't drink at all. Now, I made that choice at the age of 20 to do that. I stopped drinking. There's a justice issue. I don't have a problem with alcohol, but so many people do. So I don't drink for that reason. Because I want to be a model, particularly as a male. My whole adult life, I've been that guy who doesn't drink. Oh, you got a problem with this? No, a lot of people do, and they need a different model. And if not me, then who? And if not now, then when? So being that person in the room brings the temperature down often too. A lot of the drinking behaviour tends to slow down because the guy over there doesn't drink. So I'm okay with that. But with my kids, when they grew up in a house without alcohol, mum had a glass of wine every now and then. But when they grew up without that, I said, no, this is not necessary. It's not helpful. It's certainly going to be no good for you in developing brain. When you turn 18, if you choose to drink, you're allowed to. But you drink responsibly, you drink carefully because this stuff is dangerous. No mystery. My kids never bothered with it because it wasn't modelled. It wasn't part of their life. The questions were there. They saw their friends do it. They said, oh, they were spastic drunk and they did this and they did that. I said, yeah, that's kind of what happens, And look, as a teenager, I did drink. I did drink quite heavily. And so I got into that space and did some silly things as well. So I understood all that. But what I found was that there was no models. And that's one of the things that I think is really important in our culture, getting back to what you're talking about, is modeling something different. It's not an arduous prohibition, but it's more about, well, you know what, really, is this necessary? Well, I can certainly see the unnecessary harm caused by it. So I don't want to be party to that. But what else can we do with our time and our energies? What else can we invest in?
Yeah, it's the strategies we need to use, right? And this is where we always come back to, I know this word is so overused, but it's the holistic approach.
Mm-hmm.
What else? Because obviously talking for women is probably a generalization here, but we generally talk out our problems, where it is a little bit different for men, that they're not feeling like that's the way that they want to process. And then that turns into, well, I'll just have a couple of drinks and that's the way that I debrief. Or that's the way that, perhaps they don't have someone at home to talk to, or they're coming off a night shift and it's 1 o'clock in the morning and they can't sleep because of what happened on their shift, but the household is all asleep. So what do they do then? I'll just have a couple of drinks and then maybe I will fall asleep, those sorts of things. So what else, what other strategies can we put into people's tool belts that they don't need to turn to these things to be able to cope with the daily grind? And how can they switch off? How can we really bring in more mindfulness, more meditation, more breath work techniques, all these things that we know that can really help, that all people feel are too woo-woo to do. I'm not going on that spiritual journey. It is fundamentals of breathing that can literally de-escalate a situation for you and put you in a state of calm. We're not utilizing the tools.
No, you're right. There's a layers of tools. You said the natural and the immediate, and of course there is. People want to step into that super cultural space, do they? Welcome to it. We know that also works for many people as well. But you're right. You don't have to go. I don't want to go into the ashram and the guruing and the yoga and all those things can work. But of course, I think the fundamentals of again, communication. We as human beings, we're designed to connect. And when we connect healthily and we don't need social lubricants, and that's interesting because the social lubricant of alcohol has been sold, as you said beautifully before. We celebrate with it, we commiserate with it, we entertain with it. It's become a staple. We've got to ask the question, what's cultivated that? And of course, we know marketing's all part of that in the alcohol industry, and they're not fully to blame because we all make choices. We understand that. But the predatorial marketing and the predatorial nature of the addiction for profit industries is very clear. And we challenge that on a regular basis. And the cannabis lobby is now following the same playbook that big tobacco did. So, we're just using this whole, it's medicinal. It's got medicinal value. So again, people get locked into these, okay, this must be okay. I'm stressed. I want to de-stress. This must be okay. This is socially acceptable. This is, regardless of the long-term, even short-term harms of it, this is okay. Yeah, I did go to sleep. But we now know from alcohol, for example, alcohol is one of the worst things for sleep, for quality sleep. And so, but that data is not available. And helping, and what you're doing and what Fortem Australia does, and your consultancy and your wellbeing consultancy, what that does is help people find good methods, good coping methods to work through this stuff. So, look, I think you've answered the last question I was going to ask you about, what are some of the positive ways forward and what you're seeing. And I think that's a great answer. And I think what our listeners, there's nothing prescriptive in what Simone's just said, but the principles are really sound. Investigate those. Can we encourage you to investigate things like breathing techniques, of mindfulness, of meditation, reflection, and there's of course the spiritual side of things. If you want to step into that space, we're not discounting that. But again, these are things you can do without having substances in your life. And from a policeman's wife and a mother and a community advocate and I think that's great input. And Simone, thanks for doing that, and thanks for coming in and sharing so candidly with us again. We really do appreciate it. And
that's absolutely my pleasure. I really think that the more we have these conversations and the more we share from our own lived experiences and our own what we're doing to cope ourselves, how we can advocate for these things, it will help. We often feel that the system's broken, and how can we, there's nothing that we can do. There's absolutely something we can all do. We all have a place to make the smallest changes, whether that's for yourself, for your children, impact you're having. And I think the most challenging part about any of this is there is no right or wrong way. It's a matter of testing and measuring and what works best for you. And what someone else finds absolute pleasure and a release of going to exercise every day might work for them. And the next person hates exercising, but they love just sitting down, having a cup of coffee and listening to a podcast or turning on music. It's hard to find what is best for you. And if you haven't found that yet, I would just encourage you to keep experimenting, keep finding new things to try. A lot of the time, I do believe for men, it is finding an activity and finding a sport. Particularly that can be challenging with your work routine, with families, to find something for yourself because you're always trying to find the balance. But everyone deserves a bit of time for themselves. So communicate that to your partner and your family and find a way to move forward.
Great advice. Look, Simone Lord, thank you again for sharing with us. If you, listeners, if you want to explore some of this more, I'm sure you can reach out to Fortem Australia and to Simone herself. And what she does is fantastic. And connect us I'll get it out in a minute, folks. Connect with us through the podcast and we can connect you as well. But take those small steps. Keep, as Simone said, keep experimenting. And Simone Lord, thank you again for joining with us. And for listeners, thank you for being with us. Join us next time as we drill down on some of the key issues on alcohol and other drugs in our community on the Unnecessary Harm podcast. Until then, bye.
As we wrap up today's session, remember, each step towards understanding is a step away from unnecessary harm. We're here to empower, inspire, and pave the way for optimal well-being. Stay resilient, stay informed, and continue being the change your community needs. Thank you for joining us at the Unnecessary Harm podcast. Until next time, take care and keep pushing forward.